Welcome back, everyone, to the American Center in Moscow. My name is Josh Pang. Tonight, we have our latest edition of the Game Changer Speaker Series. With me is Dr. Brian Hainline. Brian is a clinical professor of neurology at New York University. He served as the inaugural chief medical officer of the NCAA from 2013 through May 2024. He's also the immediate past president of the U.S. Tennis Association. Dr. Hainline is an accomplished author. He's authored and edited 9 books and over 100 chapters and peer-reviewed articles, and is actively involved as a volunteer in sports medicine organizations. He's served as co-chair of the International Olympic Committee consensus meetings on both pain management in elite athletes and mental health in elite athletes. As the U.S. now is enjoying increased attention from major sporting events such as the upcoming World Cup and the Olympic Games, the sports industry here is primed for rapid growth, but at the same time, the youth and collegiate landscape has experienced dramatic change in recent years. In the midst of these trends, the question comes up, how can industry leaders and practitioners keep sports accessible and leverage it as a public good? Dr. Hainline is going to discuss his career in the sports industry, his lifelong love for tennis, and the intersection of sports, health, and well-being. Dr. Hainline, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Josh. Really is a pleasure to be here.
So, Brian, if you could tell us a bit about your early athletic background, please just share a bit about how tennis came in the picture.
Well, sure. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, and played every sport that was in front of me. But then when I was about 12 years old, I started getting particularly good in tennis, and actually grew up playing tennis in the public parks. So I would take the bus to the public parks, and then we would shovel the courts in the winter when it wasn't too cold, and ultimately had a good high school career, and then received a scholarship to play tennis at the University of Notre Dame. And there I ultimately played number 1 in singles and doubles. So tennis really gave me much of my youth and put me through school. And I continue to play. Actually, I had a great workout this morning with someone who's a gold ball winner in my age category. So meaning he's won the national championship. So still training, competing, and tennis remains really central, really as a way of being for me, and it's helped shape a lot of my professional life as well as my social life and my, I would say, my mental and physical health.
That's great. I mean, I shared that growing up in the Midwest with sports all around. Myself, I'm from Illinois, so whether, going out to the park to play tennis or just pick up basketball, I'm a hockey player myself. Soccer, that's such a foundational part of not being in the Midwest or just growing up in the U.S., I think. Could you tell us a little bit about what college athletics looked like during your time as an undergraduate at Notre Dame?
Sure. So I was an undergrad from 1974 to 1978. Notre Dame, if you don't know, it's a big football school and pretty big basketball school. And then it has about 20 other sports, tennis being one of them. So it really was an incredible way to go through college. I was a double major. My primary major was philosophy, and my secondary major was pre-med because I thought I might want to go into medical school and become a physician. And so you really had to balance your commitment to athletics with your commitment to academics. And it was really wonderful. I mean, we got to go to different parts of the country, and it usually would be in the springtime as you're getting ready. So in the Midwest, the winters are quite cold, sometimes brutally so, and we're playing on indoor courts that weren't that great. So our spring trips ranged anywhere from going out to California to going along the southeastern coast of the United States and playing schools from North Carolina down to Florida. Sometimes we would travel to Texas. And so, you're in college, but you're traveling around the country. You're competing against other schools. There's a sense of team camaraderie. And so that was wonderful. But it takes a certain discipline, because if you want to do well in school while you're committing, at least 3 hours a day to athletics, and then on the weekends and even during the week you're traveling, it means you have to make some sacrifices. You're not socializing as much as some of your friends are, and you have to learn how to study with a flashlight while you're driving in a van, because we didn't charter planes. Tennis wasn't a major sport, so it was a balancing act. But to me, it was just a phenomenal gift to be able to compete at the collegiate level and to be part of the NCAA.
Well, you bring up balance, and I think this is a theme that we'll keep throughout the conversation. But still staying with that time playing tennis at Notre Dame, what was the balance of, say, off the court workouts or practices every week? I know, I'm sure students now competing in the NCAA, that's got to be a huge chunk of their time. Was that also the case back then?
Oh yeah. So I was pretty good about sleep, and I would usually be asleep every night by about 10, assuming my roommates and everyone else on the floor weren't going crazy. So that was sometimes difficult. But I would get up every morning around 5, and I would study in the morning, and I loaded all of my classwork basically from 8 a.m. until about noon, because tennis practice began. We had to be there at 2:30, and it would go on till 5:30 or 6. So it was difficult to take afternoon classes. And the balancing act, it wasn't always easy. So there's something called organic chemistry, and the organic chemistry laboratory is basically once a week from 1:30 until 5:30. And if you don't pass organic chemistry, you don't become a physician. That's the bottom line. And I was missing lab, and so I asked the lab instructor. I said, look, I have a scholarship for tennis. Is there a way I can do makeup labs? And the professor said, look, you can make a choice, either tennis or organic chemistry, but this is how it is. So then I went to my coach and said, can you make an exception for me, for organic chemistry lab? And he said, look, you have to make a choice. You can lose your scholarship, or you can try to do well in tennis. And so I had to actually take it a couple steps further, and ultimately got that worked out. But it's not always evident, even today, that the scheduling is going to work in favor of the athletes. So for the major sports, and when I say major, I'm talking about at the Division I level. So that's the most powerful schools in the NCAA. The football athletes are pretty much taken care of. That's American football. And basketball pretty much so too, but it's still a balancing act for all the other sports. And even back then when I was an athlete, but certainly today, they have individuals who are especially assigned to the athletes to help them with their schedule. But it sometimes meant you couldn't take fun classes you wanted to take in the middle of the afternoon. You had to just basically look at the schedule and do 8 to noon. And then again, when we were traveling, you had to learn how to study sometimes while you're in a bus or on a van or this or that. But it's just, you have to learn to adapt.
Yeah. I mean, that sounds just as, if not more demanding than now, and none of the glitz of any charter plane or anything like that. After you finished at Notre Dame, you went to University of Chicago, which is just around where I grew up. When did sports neurology come into that picture?
So when I went to University of Chicago, I actually went there. I thought I was going to become a psychiatrist.
Mm-hmm.
I majored in philosophy. I did an extended independent study on Carl Jung, the psychiatrist. But then when I got there in medical school, psychiatry was really changing. It was basically all about giving drugs and kind of treating the brain like a beaker, if you will. So, and neurology was just opening up. This was in an era where for the first time we were having CAT scans. We didn't even have MRIs when I was in medical school. That wasn't until a couple of years later, but we were seeing the brain live in 3 dimensions. And so it just completely opened up the field of neurology. So I became a neurologist and Didn't play a lot of tennis during my time at University of Chicago, but did find a few people to hit with. But after that did my neurology residency at the New York Hospital, Cornell Medical Center. And I was actually planning on going into behavioral neurology, but the chair of the department said that he wanted me to start a neuro-oncology division working in conjunction with Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center and the National Institutes of Health. So this is not a well-known fact about me. My first 6 years as a neurologist, I was actually doing research in primary brain tumors, especially glioblastomas, and had sort of peripheral interest in sports neurology. Someone had approached me about writing a chapter for a boxing book about drug use in boxing, and because he knew I was very interested in sort of pharmacokinetics, pharmacology. So I did that. And that led to someone approaching me and saying, hey, why don't we write a book on drug use in athletes? And so even when I was doing my research in neuro-oncology, my first book I co-authored, it was called Drugs in the Athlete. So I got very involved kind of through another door in sports neurology by way of drug use. And then at the US Open, the orthopedic surgeons knew me there, and they invited me to come out and to look at the athletes who had these weird nerve injuries or these injuries that didn't really make sense from an orthopedic surgery point of view. So even as I was doing my research for the first 6 years of my career in primary brain tumors, I was kind of tiptoeing into the field of sports neurology and also tiptoeing into being a tennis neurologist.
Tennis was sort of just calling you back the whole way, even when you were doing research on brain tumors. I mean, that's amazing. And it sounds like for a lot of that work, you were at the forefront of what has eventually become widely researched or understood topics. I mean, even with athletes and concussions, the ways that drugs can affect athlete performance. What did it take at the start of researching these things to define those fields? Like the scientific methods, it's based on initial skepticism, right? So testing different things against verifiable fact, and it leads to people, I suppose, being maybe a little bit cautious at first of accepting new ideas in a field. What did that take for you to define it and maybe get past some of that initial posturing, perhaps?
Well, I'll start with the drug, sort of the drug use in sports idea. So the reason, and I co-authored this with a colleague, Gary Wadler, who has since passed away. And the reason we decided to do a book was because there was no comprehensive textbook or even systematic review of the literature on drug use in athletes. So we took a very, very deep dive and did essentially a systematic review of the literature on the one hand. And on the other hand, we worked with a sports editor from the New York Times. His name was George Vesey. And he got us every article that he could find that was written about drug use in athletes and how it had impacted them. But this was from a journalistic point of view. So we combined the science that we could find during the systematic review of the literature with the work from George Vesey and put that into sort of a narrative story. And we looked at every single drug that we could think of. And it was interesting at the time. So, for example, the chapter that addressed cocaine, there was no scientific literature on cocaine use at that time. This is a book published in 1989. The best we could find was a book written by Sigmund Freud called On Coca. And in that book, Freud describes a series of self-experimentations. It's kind of funny, actually, where he would test his strength, and then he would do a few snorts of cocaine and then test his strength after that and say, wow, I feel more energized and stronger and this and that. And then, at that time, there was emerging literature about amphetamine use in baseball players. So we wrote this book, but what was more interesting is that this was before the World Anti-Doping Agency was formed. And so this book became foundational for ultimately a lot of the principles that were used in the World Anti-Doping Agency. And Gary Wadler actually made a secondary career out of that. And then WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, they started taking the science much further. So the book sort of became a foundation for that. It was reasonably scientific, but we had more questions than answers. And then the work through the World Anti-Doping Agency really took that in a massively different direction and much more comprehensive and scientific. But I will say the science just wasn't on how to understand doping and detect those who were doping. The science was also by those who were doping. They were working with scientists to figure out, what's the best drug I can use that's not going to be detected by drug testing. So it was very, very interesting. And just maybe to finish the chapter on that, I was on the board of directors of the United States Anti-Doping Agency at a time when we were actively investigating Lance Armstrong for doping in sport. And it was a very, very challenging time. Some of us were receiving death threats for investigating, sort of who was considered just the supreme athlete and an American model and this and that. And ultimately, as we know, Lance was found guilty. We had piles and piles of evidence. And the chair at the time, if you know your sports history, was Edwin Moses, who won gold in 3 different Olympics in the hurdles. And Edwin is probably the most ethical person I've ever met, and really wanted to be certain that this cloud of doping in sport could be eliminated. So that was an extraordinary time. And then, after that, I kind of moved away from doping in sport. But it was also around the same time, it was 1992. Well, actually, I'll go to 1991. I got a call on a Friday night from a colleague, and he was at Hospital for Joint Diseases, which was part of New York University. And he was starting an epilepsy center there because he didn't have room at the main campus. So here we are in an orthopedic hospital, and he has an epilepsy center, and he was getting all these consults for things he didn't want to see, orthopedic injuries that related to nerve injuries and this and that. So he called me up out of the blue and said, Brian, I word on the street is that you're getting pretty burnt out in neuro-oncology, which I was. There was no cure. I went to all of my patients' funerals. Every one of my patients except one died. And I just wasn't cut out to be an oncologist. And he said, would you like to come to Hospital for Joint Diseases, New York University, and become the director of clinical and sports neurology? And I said, I don't even know what sports neurology is. I'm not sure that's a field. And he said, yeah, I knew you would say that, but you're an athlete, you'll figure it out. And I said, well, what's being an athlete have to do with figuring out an academic discipline? But that phone call out of the blue, and that's sort of a lesson in life. I mean, I didn't study to become a sports neurologist and had no idea I ever would be. And I got a phone call out of the blue and accepted the challenge. And that was sort of my move into an entirely new discipline of medicine.
And thank you for going through all of that so thoroughly. I mean, it's incredible where just an appreciation of sport has led you, but also to hear that wasn't always at the top of mind. From there, you had roles with the U.S. Open, with the USTA, with the International Tennis Federation. In your roles as an executive in these organizations, are there any stories that really stand out to you from projects that you led or people that you met?
Well, I'll start with the U.S. Open. So just like in 91, I got that call out of the blue from a colleague to start a sports neurology division at NYU. And later that year, I got a call from the executive director of the U.S. Tennis Association. So in 1991, a player at the U.S. Open, he almost died of heat stroke. And so heat stroke is a medical emergency. It means that your core temperature has gone over 40 degrees Celsius or 104 degrees Fahrenheit. And your organs literally can die. And it usually is a result of playing in a very hot and humid condition. You lose more sweat and water than you ingest. Your body starts getting overheated while you're really dehydrated, and then you can go into multi-organ failure and die. The treatment is very simple. It's ice water immersion, and it's 100% cure if you do that right away. But at the U.S. Open, there were 5 of, really very, very well-known orthopedic surgeons, but there was no game plan. It was all kind of what we call mom and pop care. So no one knew if there was an ambulance, if there were IVs. There certainly wasn't an ice bath. They weren't ready for a major catastrophe. They were really ready to take care of rotator cuff injuries and the like. So so there was an investigation, and the U.S. Open decided they needed to really redo the medical care. And they called me up and asked if I would become the chief medical officer. And initially I refused. I said, I'm a neurologist. And this is back in 92. So certainly there was no neurologist in the world who was a chief medical officer of a sporting event. And almost all of the chief medical officers were orthopedic surgeons. That's just how it was back then. And I said, look, the orthopedic surgeons are going to have a field day. I'm going to be on the front page of the New York Post, and they're going to say how the U.S. Open doesn't know what they're doing, and they hired a neurologist, and medical care is going to be terrible. But the U.S. Tennis Association convinced me that I should do it. They said, put together a team, put together a game plan. So it's another example of you're not prepared for something, but you just have to conceptualize it and say, well, how could I make this work? Number one, am I willing to risk failure in something I've never done before? And am I willing to possibly risk making breakthroughs and doing something really phenomenal and as an exciting journey? So it's a lot of inner talk, and you have to assess your level of confidence and where you want to go in life. So I presented a plan to them. They accepted it. I was chief medical officer. For the first time, my number 2 person was an internist and not an orthopedic surgeon. And I did have an orthopedic surgeon as well. And I stayed in that role for 16 years. And I think the most important thing, and by the way, I was on the front page of the New York Post, or the back page is kind of front back. And they said how, Hainline's not qualified to be the chief medical officer and this and that. But, that comes with the territory. But I did that. And I think the most important thing we did there was twofold. One is, it used to be before matches, players would just come into the player treatment area and say, hey, can you give me some ibuprofen, or can you give me some naproxen? And I set up a policy. I said, no one gets anything unless they are properly evaluated. And the players hated that. Sure. But we changed the culture. And then I talked to the other 3 Grand Slams. So we're the U.S. Open. The other 3 are Wimbledon, Roland Garros, or the French Open, and then the Australian Open. And we said we should really unify our protocols, unify our data collection, and we all did. And then we started doing the same thing with the ATP and WTA tour. So the ATP tour, the Association of Tennis Professionals, is the men's professional tour. The WTA, the Women's Tennis Association, is the women's professional tour. So the thing I think that was most important was just unifying our protocols and trying to collect data so that we could understand what really is happening. At the other thing at the time, because of the heat stroke the year before and heat cramps and everything was a really big deal. And this is sort of a funny story. It is public. And it was my first year on the job. And the tournament director said, Jimmy Connors wants to meet with you. I said, well, why does he want to meet with me? He said, I don't know. I didn't ask. So I met with him, and it was kind of in the back part of the stadium in this very small room. And Jimmy Connors was there with his bodyguard. And I'm in this room, and the bodyguard standing in front of the door. I said, what can I do for you, Mr. Connors? He says, well, I'm glad you asked, because this is what you're going to do. I'm going to weigh myself before every match. And if I'm 4 pounds more or more after the match, this is how much IV fluid you're going to put in me. And this is the rate it's going to be. So he had, asked someone else. And I said, well, I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that. And I tried to walk out of the room, and the bodyguard stopped me. And so then Connor said, well, you are going to do that. And so, this is where you have to assess yourself inside. And that would be highly unethical to do something like that, in my opinion. I said, I'm not going to do that, Mr. Connors, but this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to teach you that you can hydrate orally because you don't need an IV. And I'm going to teach you that even under the best of circumstances, I can put an IV in your right arm or left arm and it could blow. And the vein could get swollen. You could get a thrombosis. And by the way, I know you're left-handed, but you use your right hand for your two-handed backhand. And so, I could really, or if we have the best IV therapist in the world, we could jeopardize your ability to win because you are getting stupid advice and you're not drinking properly. But I'll tell you this, you might come off the court and you're 12 pounds under and you're unconscious, and I'll have an IV in you before you can even blink because I'll save your life. And so I did all that. Connors looked at the bodyguard. He gave him a nod, and he let the bodyguard let me go out of the room. I walked out of the room, and then I ran into a bathroom and vomited for about 5 minutes because I was so nervous. But it was kind of like, you have to stand up for what you believe is right. And I have tons of stories from the U.S. Open about ethically based decisions, and happy to talk about them if we have time, because that was really important. And the most important thing I thought I could do was to not just unify the protocols and collect the data, but to start a standard of really ethics-based care where the athlete is at the center, but we're never taking shortcuts. The athlete is never getting, we call it in America VIP treatment. It stands for very important person treatment. We're never doing that. They're getting care as if they're anyone else, and we're making certain that they're getting the care that is the best for them, and we're not taking shortcuts. So, yeah, the U.S. Open, those 16 years were really formative, and it changed really much of my life.
I love what you said about being ready for opportunities, or opportunities presenting themselves when you don't feel fully ready, still having to take them on, and having to stand up for your ethics, even in the face of a bodyguard. That's incredible. Now you've been going to the topic of doing what's right for the athlete, not necessarily just giving them VIP treatment, making them feel invincible, but actually giving them the truth, even if it's hard, doing what's best for them. And I don't want to preempt your response, but I feel that must have been an important part of you becoming this chief medical officer in the NCAA, when you're dealing with the wellness of young athletes, young student athletes, kids who have every reason to push themselves to the limit when maybe it's not the healthy choice. Could you tell us a little bit about some of your work with the NCAA, and then maybe talk about the current state of college athletics as you see it now?
Yeah, so the NCAA was another job that kind of came out of the blue. So I was the NCAA's first chief medical officer. So for those of you who don't know, the NCAA stands for the National Collegiate Athletic Association. It's really a uniquely American program or institution, if you will. It's 1,100 universities and colleges and 500,000 athletes. We call them student athletes. There are 90 different championships, and there's over 24 different sports. And it's divided into divisions: Division I, Division II, and Division III. Division I are the larger schools like University of Alabama, University of Florida, University of North Carolina. Division II are sort of intermediate size school, and Division III are the smaller liberal arts schools. And so in 2013, at that time, there was no full-time chief medical officer in any sport organizations in the United States. Not at the NFL, which that's for American football, not for Major League Baseball, not for the National Hockey League, and not for any of the governing bodies of the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee. In fact, the U.S. Tennis Association was the only either not-for-profit or professional governing body of sport that had a part-time chief medical officer, and that happened to be me. And at that time, again, the only governing body in the world that had a full-time chief medical officer was FIFA. So for football, European football and world football. So and by the way, that person was fired and replaced by a lawyer. So so the NCAA was really thinking ahead of its time by saying we should have a full-time chief medical officer. And I wasn't expecting this call at all, but someone called and said, hey, you should consider applying for the job and this and that. I discussed it with my wife, and she said, yeah, why not? It was complicated because the NCAA headquarters are in Indianapolis, which is in the Midwest in the state of Indiana. And my wife and I were living in New York. We still live in New York. So it was going to be complicated, but again, never in my wildest dreams did I think I was going to train to become the chief medical officer of the NCAA. By being their chief medical officer, it took me way out of neurology, because if you're thinking about sport, you're talking about cardiac conditions and mental health conditions and infectious disease conditions and catastrophic injury and death. And then, of course, we had COVID in the middle of that. And I, all of a sudden had to become an infectious disease expert. And so it's like in life, in our professional life, even in our personal life, we sort of set out for our journey, but sometimes things happen and then we assess whether we're willing to take a leap. It's almost a leap of faith, because no one prepares you for this. And so I it was interesting during the interview process. I really wasn't sure I wanted to do this. And I was in a very, very fortunate position because I didn't need the job and I wasn't sure I wanted it. So during the interview, I said, look, I would consider this, but only if the NCAA will place sport as a public good, and that will be its priority. Because the NCAA, at that time, I thought they had more ability to impact American sport than any other governing body in the country. And they agreed with that. And so I arrived, it was like a blank slate. There were no instructions. And the first thing I did was I called up the leaders of a lot of the American sports medicine and medical societies. So, for example, I called up the leadership of the American Medical Society for Sports Medicine, the American Orthopedic Society for Sports Medicine, the American Academy of Neurology, the American Hematology Association. And I asked all of them if they would be willing to collaborate with me to help shape different sorts of best practices. But it was tricky because they could help me shape them, but all of the legislation and ultimately all of the guidance must come from the membership. So I worked side by side with a committee. They were called the Committee on Competitive Safeguards and Medical Aspects of Sports, and the membership. And we worked together to put together these best practices. And all of these organizations endorsed them. So we had best practices on the best way to address and manage mental health in collegiate athletes, the best way to do cardiac screening, the best way to do concussion care, the best way to really make certain you have independent medical care. So it was really, it was just an exceptional time. It was like an intellectual feast. And it was the most collaborative part of my career ever, because you're working again with 1,100 universities and about 30 medical and scientific organizations and inside the NCAA professional staff. And what we would do is we would have these think tanks all of the time and say, okay, what are the major issues and how can we best address them? And I would give two examples that really stand out. One was concussion. At the time, the literature was stating that concussions cause chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is not true. But we had no data. And so we meaning the NCAA, we started a concussion study with the Department of Defense, which, by the way, is still going on. And we're currently following 55,000 student athletes and cadets prospectively over 25 plus years and getting incredible data. So that was one great thing. And another is we developed what was called the NCAA mental health best practices, endorsed by 25 of the leading medical, scientific, and psychological organizations in the country. They were so successful that the International Olympic Committee then called me and asked if I would be willing to co-chair their first ever International Olympic Committee consensus meeting on mental health in elite athletes, using the NCAA sort of as the foundation. So it just was really a remarkable journey and collaboration. And what we really did is, with every single task force or summit, we always said, this is for the most sacred asset in sport, and that's the student athlete. And so as long as you keep grounded there, I think you'll end up with good outcomes.
It sounds like a really fulfilling experience, or range of experiences, starting from a job that you mentioned at the time you didn't need, but came to all this. Now, you said at the start it was essential for the NCAA to make sure that for you to be part of their operations, that they keep sport as a public good, focus on that. What do you mean by sport as a public good? What does that entail?
That sport really can be a pathway for improving public health, and it can be a pathway also for improving the well-being of human development. And it sounds, grandiose and everything, but it really is quite simple. So, and it rests on a few core principles. One is that we should not be using athletes for something else other than their development. Now, there can be secondary things. You can, you have TV rights, you make money, and schools become recognized because they win championships and so forth. But that the focus has to be on the athlete and what we call human development. And the other thing was really looking at sport from an evolutionary perspective, because sport really is a recreation of what it means to be Homo sapiens. We hunt and we gather, or we'll throw things, we'll swim, we'll dig, we'll jog, we'll run, we'll walk for 100 miles, and all of these things become codified, if you will, in somewhat arbitrary rules and regulations that define a specific sport. And when I say arbitrary, like, let's look at tennis. Why does the net have to be 3 feet high and not 4 feet high? And why is the scoring system 15, 30, 40 game and not something else? And so, or in soccer or European football, why is the soccer field, this length and not longer? And so you make these rules like in society, but you follow them. And so it's understanding that sport is essential for really being at our core who we are as human beings from an evolutionary point of view. And we have data, and very worrisome data, that those who cannot do sport, so there's something called physical literacy. We know what scientific literacy is, mathematical literacy. Physical literacy means that you have the ability, confidence, and desire to be meaningfully active in exercise and sport for life. When you are physically illiterate, you actually have a greater risk of school dropout, of developing diseases such as diabetes, obesity, high cholesterol, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, of becoming addicted to alcohol or drugs, and of dropping out of the workforce. So sport is so critical to who we are as humans and for our health and our well-being. And we know that sport is actually protective against mental health disorders. So that sport is public good, but as a society, when we don't address it, when we don't have equal access to sport, when it's overly professionalized at a young level, then it's no longer for the public good.
Gotcha. Yeah, we had a conversation with Marty Fox from the Aspen Institute a little while ago, talking about some of those impacts that you just described, mostly focusing on the youth side. Maybe you could illuminate us a bit beyond what we had discussed before about the impact on youth, but also maybe adult and aging populations, and not just in the U.S. but everywhere in the world.
Yeah, so there's a concept called long-term athlete development. In America, it's called the American Development Model.
Mm-hmm.
And it's maybe the most fundamental model in all of sport. It means that wherever you are in your life, whether you're 3 years old or 5 years old or 83 years old or 93 years old, you should be participating in sport in a way that is developmentally appropriate. That's so key. And it means developmentally appropriate physically, mentally, psychologically, and socially. So one of the mistakes we make is we assume children are like miniature adults, and they're not. They're not anything like miniature adults. So what is developmentally appropriate for a 5-year-old physically on a baseball field is very different than for a 15-year-old and for someone at their peak who's 25 years old. What about socially? Well, 5-year-olds, they think very differently than 15-year-olds. Same thing psychologically and mentally. So that's on the one hand. And then let's say there's someone who's 60 or 70, they've been physically inactive most of their life, and they want to go out and engage in sport. Well, we don't put them on a bike and say, do a 100-mile bike ride, and we don't put them on a full-length tennis court. For tennis, they should be starting on a small court with a small racket with a red ball and learn proper footwork. And maybe that's all they do for the rest of their life. So the idea of developmentally appropriate activities is the most important thing we can think of. I think the secondary phenomenon, and it goes right along with this, is this concept of early specialization. So early specialization means that you're uniquely training in one sport before the age of puberty. And we know that early specialization is associated with peaking at an early age, an increase in overuse injuries, and an increase in dropping out of sport. So there's really no advantage to early specialization, and it usually is through poorly educated coaches or parents who just want to push their kids so that they're going to excel early on and they're going to, become these star athletes. But it doesn't work. In fact, we recently published a study with the National Basketball Association, and we looked at decades of data from National Basketball Association players, and the overwhelming majority of them did not specialize early in basketball. In fact, they played multiple sports before the age of puberty. So that's a secondary concept which is critical in youth sport. And so if we stay grounded in that, and we don't overly professionalize sport just to make a bunch of money off of kids, but we think about, again, the kids as our sacred asset, well, that's how we can get things right.
Gotcha. I love this idea of the development model extending beyond just kids, even to people just starting sport, as you said, maybe in their 60s or 70s. Very familiar with the model. I think it came from USA Hockey. Correct me if I'm wrong. But in my time, just like doing certifications as a youth coach, they always kept coming back to this idea of like, make sure your kids, before I think it was the age of 12 or 14, make sure they're really doing everything else in the off season other than hockey. Make sure they're playing soccer or whatever. So definitely keeping that focus would be really valuable. So we're starting to get some questions in our chat. It'd be great to go through some of these, and then we'll wrap up in about 15 and send you on your way. So let's see. Our first one, why do you think people form such strong emotional connections to teams and athletes?
Yeah, so I think that's part of what it means to be human. It's part of our evolution. And, we're social creatures. We love to identify, even going back to the hunter-gatherers, they would identify as social creatures and in certain groups. And, and then we we sort of understand sport as an expression of humanity, and we all like to be part of a team. I mean, that's just part of who we are. We like to be part of a clique. And so sport is essentially human. And then when you add a team to it, and then you kind of live vicariously through that experience. So it makes all the sense in the world, because just like I think, sport teams is no different than going to a great concert too. And you kind of really start following a certain band or certain musicians, and it's just so uniquely human, and that's why we thrive with that.
I think we can get to the next two together. How can recreational sports improve quality of life in cities and communities? And maybe as an attachment to that, what about tennis? What can tennis specifically do for that?
So when I was president of the USTA, we changed our mission statement. The mission used to be to promote and develop the growth of tennis. Okay, fine, but it's not very exciting. So we changed it to growing tennis to enhance physical and mental health in communities. It was growing tennis to inspire healthier people in communities everywhere. So that was the mission statement. So you grow the game, but it really is inspiration for healthier people in communities. So you can use sport within communities, and let's take tennis as an example. You can get young kids out there, you can get teenagers, you can get adolescents, and you can get parents and grandparents, and they're all playing together. And so making tennis part of a community, and sometimes it's done through church groups, sometimes it's done through youth organization groups, but even with, in the United States, there are a lot of public parks, and even rallying it around public parks where people can kind of grow, and it becomes, leisure is a very important aspect of stepping outside of our day-to-day life, and sport and community can do that. Tennis in particular, I think it can do that because it's multi-generational. So I'm 70 years old. I can go out there and I'm playing with my 18-year-old granddaughter, and even with my 8-year-old granddaughter, and everyone in between. And so that's, I think, what really makes tennis so unique. But any sport can be a community effort.
Great. Yeah, that intergenerational aspect is key. I think of even playing adult league for hockey. We've got senior groups and the kids who come right out of college. It's all very different, but that sort of community across ages, that's hugely important. Let's see. We've got a question about physical literacy, which we just discussed. Do you think kids today are spending enough time being physically active?
So I'll answer this question from an American point of view, because I don't have great intel on other countries. But in America, it's absolutely not the case. So there has been a progressive segregation of physical activity out of public schools in our country. So it means that you're no longer getting physical education for an hour a day, which I had when I was growing up.
Yeah.
And kids are not going out and going out on the playgrounds and doing chin-ups and pull-ups and rock climbing and this and that. They're on their cell phones or their tablets or something like that. In fact, we know that in the United States that 90% of high school seniors are so physically illiterate they could not be part of the military. So that's not only a national defense issue. That's an issue that those individuals are basically a setup for developing all sorts of medical and mental health problems for life. So unequivocally, kids are not getting enough physical activity. And, in America, that is being replaced by state-sponsored tests that, have not improved our scientific and mathematical and reading literacy in our country either. So we need to really rethink the importance of having a nation of physically literate children.
Yeah. And it seems like it wouldn't be the biggest investment cost to have what would end up being a lot of dividends across the board.
Yeah.
Let's see. Another question. Getting into that idea of specialization, how can parents and coaches recognize when that becomes unhealthy or overly stressful for a young athlete?
Look, I think it's through education. So another problem in the United States, and look, I love our country, but we don't do everything necessarily the right way. We're one of the few countries in the world that doesn't have a minister of sport. So there's no central oversight of sport. And the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee is not empowered to oversee all of youth sport. So you have this disparate group of people and organizations who are getting involved in sport for various reasons. And coaches, to be a coach in the United States, you just have to hold up a piece of paper and say, I'm a coach. It doesn't require thousands of hours of training. So we really need to educate the coaches first and foremost, that early specialization will get you some short-term results, but it won't get you any long-term results. In fact, it'll be negative long-term results. So it's a progressive educational process. And there are some organizations that are doing it really well. Like I'll call out USA Football, which is American football. And they're the governing body for youth football. They do a great job of educating their coaches. I think the U.S. Tennis Association is doing that as well. And the coaches learn that the kids should be playing multiple sports, not just tennis before the age of puberty. So it's a consistent educational process. What country in the world does it the best? Probably Norway.
Yeah, they were, I wanted to say, they topped the medal charts in, I think it was this most recent Winter Olympics, right?
They top the medal charts in the Winter Olympics, and they have a great pathway. Look, they're a smaller country. It's a bit more homogenous, but they have a great developmental pathway for their youth.
Sure. Now, this next question is just about how the business side of sports has changed the experience of athletes. But I want to maybe tie that actually into the Olympics. We'll have that here in 2028. We've got the World Cup this year. There's already so much discourse about how the commercialization of sport is sort of removing accessibility. You got these high ticket prices for the World Cup, concerns about how the infrastructure for LA 28 is going to be built up, stuff like that. Can you talk a bit about how business has changed sport, but also maybe some opportunities that business has to actually maybe make sport more accessible than perhaps what the current trajectory is?
Yeah, so look at the top level, because look, there are fans who are just sport hungry. They love teams. And so the National Football League in the United States is the prime example of how to professionalize and commercialize sport and make a ton of money. But if you follow a National Football League team, you can still have a good experience, except going to a game live. Then you gotta, you're not going to have a prime seat. You might be in what we call the nosebleed section, but still people don't necessarily seem to mind that. At the US Open, we think about this a lot. How can we be certain that tennis is accessible for everyone? So a lot of people don't understand or realize that the first week of the US Open, which is for the qualifying draw, but it's when all the main draw players are training, it's 100% free. So anyone can come in, and they're seeing numbers 100 against 200 in the world competing for 16 slots in the qualifying draw. So it's being imaginative like that. At the collegiate level, I think it really makes sense to me that collegiate athletes are able to make money, but what's called name, image, and likeness, it has no controls for it right now. And so it's kind of all over the place. And the concern is that athletes can be taken advantage of, or that they aren't necessarily protected with their contracts. And so that's a good and a bad. Good that the athletes are able to make money, bad that we haven't really found a way to regulate it properly yet. The concern I have is at the youth sport level. It's becoming more professionalized. So it means that you need money if you want your child to play in youth sport. And that's actually my biggest concern, because again, going back to schools, everyone should have universal access to sport. Nelson Mandela, one of my heroes, he said you can judge a society by how it treats sport, and especially youth sport. And from that point of view, I think we need better grades. We need to find that sports should not be something that you have to be wealthy to participate in at the youth level.
Certainly. I want to tie this back to something you've said before. You were quoted as saying during your time as a college tennis player that it was the first time you understood that life has a purpose, that tennis has a purpose, and that tennis gives me purpose. Now, if you were a college athlete today, in the context of everything that we've been discussing, would you come away with those same lessons, and to what degree?
I think it depends on your identity, and we talk about that. So just so everyone knows, this July or August, I'm not sure which month, the second International Olympic Committee consensus statement on mental health and elite athletes is going to be published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, and I'm the senior author on that, so I know it well, and was co-chair of the summit. And we talk about athlete identity and the risk of identifying yourself too much as an athlete versus as a soulful human being. And so for me, and I think for any college athlete today, if they see sport as part of their human development and stay connected to their sport, but they don't identify as that soccer player, but as someone who's playing soccer. And so it really is a mindset. So if you're completely locked in your identity as an athlete, and then you are no longer participating at the same level, well, you can have a crisis. So I think even today, and the NCAA does a very good job of helping athletes to identify as humans first, and not to identify as an athlete first.
Sure.
And then you use your athletics to help you have fun for the rest of your life, you know?
That's fantastic. That goes into, I guess, our next question from the audience. How can we encourage adults to continue staying active through sports later in life beyond, let's say, their prime?
Well, I think that's part of the longevity message. You know, everyone's obsessed with longevity. You know, I want to live forever, and you know, we're getting infusions and taking these pills and this and that, and we're missing the most profound evidence we have that being physically active and having a good diet. You know, what's a good diet? Well, you know, make sure that you have a lot of good colors that are and they're natural colors and not food colors in your diet, and you know, you get the right balance. Those two things alone will improve longevity better than anything out there. And so it just has to be part of the messaging that being physically active, and it's not just about longevity. You know, once you're over the age of 50, you will progressively lose muscle mass unless you actively engage. But the good news is you can gain muscle mass if you stay engaged. And the other thing is sports and activity help us with our balance. What's one of the biggest risk factors for the elderly? They fall, they fracture a hip, they fracture a skull. So it's just so important, not only for the length of your life, but for the quality of your life. And so it's really just getting that message universally across.
We certainly hope to be doing a small part of that here today. I want to close with a question that's a bit outside of the realm of sports medicine or health. You spent so much of your career defining sport as a public good and defining new fields. Sport is having this sort of rise in terms of its prioritization in places like DC, and you see this in like the American Decade of Sports Act, for example. That's somewhere in Congress right now. I'm not exactly sure what the latest update was, but all this attention towards sports diplomacy, things that are prioritizing sport in terms of not just business, but something that brings people together and trying to formalize it in the U.S. With all of this new attention, people take different tracks to it. What advice can you give as somebody who has defined sport as a public good for so much of your career? What advice can you give to people who are building out a field like sports diplomacy, something like we're doing here, even talking to foreign audiences or people who might not share the same background as us and connect over sports?
Yeah, Look, I think it's like anything in life. If we believe in certain messaging, so if we believe in sport as a public good, if we believe in healthy capitalism, or if we believe in a different form of governance. So it's a belief structure, and then we spend our life trying to help develop that. And so I think, for all the listeners today, if they likely have some interest in sport and sport as a public good, it's being open-minded to the possibilities that are going to come into your life, so or how you can become part of that. And it could be at a leadership level, or it could be as a silent partner, or it could be just at the local community level. It really, it doesn't matter at what level. It's what's fulfilling to you. But I think with any core concept that we believe is truthful, these are the things that are sort of the pillars for how we shape our life. And when opportunities come, we take those opportunities to help shape our life further around those ideals.
Well, Brian, thank you so much for sharing just a bit of all the insight that you have about sport as public good, your career history, your love for tennis. I certainly enjoyed our conversation. I hope our audience did too. I want to thank our audience for their attendance, for their participation, and our next events will be June 2nd. We will actually have Katrina Adams on to speak, also involved heavily, as you know, in U.S. tennis. So we'll look forward to that conversation. And then our next FIFA World Cup speaker series event, that will be later in June. And we will announce a speaker for that soon. For Dr. Hainline, I'm Josh. Thank you so much for tuning into the American Center in Moscow tonight. Everybody take care, and we'll see you next time.
All right.